Thank you and welcome everybody. Thank you for not staying at home and trying to watch the television if it's not raining in Manchester. I'm not sure if it is or not. We've got my name's John Elliott. I'm a journalist and an author, and I've lived in India for 25 years or so till last year when I moved back here. And we've got two distinguished speakers. Navin Chawla, the author of our book, which is Every Vote Counts, The Story of India Elections. Navin is a former bureaucrat in the Indian Administrative Service and who finished his career as Chief Election Commissioner, a very well-known Chief Election Commissioners, as they all are these days. And earlier, he wrote a biography of Mother Teresa, and I'm sure he must have written other books too, but I've only noted the Mother Teresa one, and this one, which is a very important report on the Indian election system. And Mukulika Banerjee, well known on the literary and academic scene in London, who heads the LSE South Asia Centre and is a professor in social anthropology and political science. Her earlier books include Why India Votes, which we've got somewhere. And you're now completing a monograph on cultivating democracy based on 15 years of research in rural India, and you spent quite a lot of the recent election campaign in West Bengal, which I think was probably about the most interesting state to be in the last election. It's fashionable to say that Uttar Pradesh is always the most important and everything else, but I think the contrast in West Bengal and what was happening there is, and we will be coming round to that. And Navin, just generally, before we get round to your book on the election scene, in this recent election, 900 electorate, 900 million electorate, including 430 women, 600 million voters, in 7 phases, over 1 million voting booths, some extremely remote, only one voter apparently in the Gir forest looking after Narendra Modi's lions, and 4 million electronic voting machines and 11 million election personnel. How about that? Straight off Wikipedia. Tell us about it.
Well, I must tell you about the single voter in the middle of the Gir forest to begin, which is also why it's called Every Vote Counts. Because we have, in the middle of the Gir forest, when there was an attempt to get the habitation, the small village, to move because of the lions, there was one person who said he just won't move, and he was the priest of the local Shiva temple. So we tried over long years, but it didn't work. So for every election, that's every 2.5 years, a general election and a state assembly election, we have to send 8 people there in the middle of all these lions in a tiny little hutment, as it were, where an election office is opened. It's open just for him. And he knows that it's open just for him. And he strolls in after his puja, which could be 3 in the afternoon, 4, sometimes tantalizingly at 5 o'clock when we're about to close. So that too is Every Vote Counts.
Is he a loyal Gujarati in his voting habit?
Well, he's quite cross because he says he likes the press attention, of course, but he says no candidate comes to canvass his vote.
And then there's some up in the Himalayas where people trek for days to get there.
Yes, we had this exciting adventure, and our people are so participative, all our staff and so on. So the helicopter couldn't leave that day because the weather was terrible, and we waited for the next day too, and the weather was terrible, and the pilot said they can't go. So we said, all right, now if they can't go, and we'll count these last 2 polling stations, which are up at 23,000 feet in the Himalayas. Well, it won't make that much of a difference. We'll count them later. But our boys in Srinagar said, no, we're going to trek. So I said, trek? You're going to trek all the way? Yes, we'll trek. So I said, I hope you're all able-bodied, because now we don't want a casualty on the way. But they did. They trekked through the night. They slept in a cave. They didn't take tents. They slept in a cave which perhaps bears otherwise inhabited. They reached 23,000. and they cast the votes in 2 polling stations, Fema and Ralakong, both close to each other. 16 voters in one, 22 in the other. Of the 22, one was a conscientious objector, so we had 21. And these were the first 2 stations we counted in all India as a tribute to our people who were so brave.
But sitting in the centre, sitting in Delhi, how do you manage it? I mean, just briefly, how does you as the election commissioner, funnel it all down to the guys who are going to walk into the Gir forest or trek in the Himalayas? I mean, it's a management problem. I mean, I'm not politics, but management.
Yeah, it's not a management problem.
Or management task.
It's the most interesting management exercise, and indisputably the largest in the world. But I was lucky. I was the 16th Chief Election Commissioner. We've had this has been going on now since the first election in 1951-52. So an architecture had already been built, and all of us who come along have added a little to it. So the tribute really lies with those who set it up in the beginning.
Mukulika, you've watched a few of these elections, and you've been as I said, there watching them, not just from London. What's your impression of the whole? Before we get into some of the problems, but what is your view of the whole exercise?
Well, I have to say that having lived in Britain for 29 years, and as a Commonwealth citizen, I get a vote here, I'm always struck by the contrast of a British and an Indian election, where here you can, if you were visiting Britain on the day of polls, nothing would indicate that there was an election on. Right? And you went to work and nobody talked about whether you voted, your finger wasn't marked, and then you had no evidence that you might have voted, nobody talked about it. Whereas, as any visitor to India during the elections will know, electoral time is carnival time in India. The whole country eases into a completely different gear. So the Model Code of Conduct comes in, which the Election Commission announces. So everybody is expected to conduct themselves in a different way. There is electoral temporality. Time becomes different. The landscape is transformed by the heat and the dust of political campaigns, processions, rallies. Helicopters increasingly so. The landscape is transformed by the colors of political parties and buntings and banner. There are roving cycle rickshaw vans with loudspeakers from various candidates. So it's a sensory assault being in an Indian election. And everywhere you go, from the moment you land, from the baggage handlers at the airport to immigration officials seem to be aware that this is the largest thing the country does. It's topmost in everybody's minds. This is even before you start a conversation. So this speciality, this is, the charged nature of elections in India, I think is quite special. The only other country I've actually physically been present during an election was Italy, which had a little bit of that in a small town. But this being India, everything, as we heard, the scale is larger, but the intensity is also deeper.
It was in Orissa, I last saw it, when the helicopter comes in and the dust rises up and everybody goes, rah, rah, and the chief minister gets out. And the dust and the chaos is amazing. I don't want to get into the recent election campaign till a bit later. But since we're talking about this, why don't you tell us about your experience in West Bengal and how you saw the BJP and the Modi and Hanuman and the excitement? Because I've heard you talk before at another session about the excitement and how the BJP harnessed the young crowd. Okay. As I said, let's not make it politics. It's much more about the drama that I'm asking, and how they arouse this state, which until now has always been communist or Congress.
Yes, so for those of you who don't know, West Bengal on the eastern part of India has had 34 years of continuous left front rule from 1977 to 2011, a coalition of parties dominated by the Communist Party of India, Marxist, and then the Communist Party of India, Forward Bloc, RSP, and so on, the coalition of parties. So communism has been democratic. This is the only instance in the world where a communist government has been democratically elected for this long. And then it was replaced by a small new party led by a politician with an enormous mass base, Mamata Banerjee, no relative of mine, but she was a breakaway from the the Congress in West Bengal. So this itself was a coup to have not only overturned the left front hegemony of 34 years, but also that it was being done by not the fact just that she was a woman, but also that she did not belong to the urbane intelligentsia that the communist leadership was drawn from, which was very patriarchal, which was very upper caste, very bhadralok, as would be called in Bengal. Now, so Mamata Banerjee was quite comfortably secure in West Bengal. But West Bengal has a very significant number of states. There are 29 states in India. West Bengal has 42 states in the National Assembly. So it's a very significant block of votes. So any political party that wants to gain power in Delhi is looking to gain votes in all states, but especially in a place like West Bengal where there is a possibility. Now, the BJP, which is the ruling government, is the party of the ruling government, had its eye on West Bengal. And everybody thought, well, West Bengal, not really. BJP stands for a certain kind of North Indian, upper caste, masculine Hinduism. And its political uses, not even Hinduism, but Hindutva, the political ideology that mobilizes the religion of Hinduism for political purposes, very different from the religion itself. And so West Bengal was not seen to be a likely place where they were likely to make gains. And what John wants me to talk about is actually going to West Bengal in April 2019. What was remarkable was everywhere you went, and I was there around the New Year celebrations. You know, most lunar calendars begin in the middle of April. Most communities in India mark the start of the New Year. There was Ram Navami, right, which is the worship of Lord Ram, but it's his birthday that is celebrated. That's a fairly pan-Indian festival. In Bengal, it was a bit of a non-event because Ram is not part of the 33,000 gods and goddesses who are worshipped in Bengal and in India. I mean, the Hindu pantheon is very Catholic. And so Ram Navami had gained popularity over the last few years. But for the very first time, what I was witnessing was young men worshipping Hanuman. And Hanuman, for those of you who don't know, will have seen, the British Library has some wonderful prints of Hanuman, the monkey god, as is rather crudely translated. But Hanuman is Ram's constant companion, helped him win his wife back, etc. Now, Hanuman is a very interesting religious figure. I have been, from the age of 16, chanting Hanuman Chalisa. I know about the worship of Hanuman as a Hindu. And here was suddenly Hanuman in the state of West Bengal, where I've never lived, but spent a lot of time, young men getting together and worshipping these idols, which I'd never seen. So I asked everywhere I went, I said, you know, when did this idol of Hanuman come about? How long have you had this? And a story that was widely repeated was, you know, last year, about 4 months ago, 5 months ago, this truck went by and this idol just fell off it. And it was destined to be here. So we brought it home and of course we worshipped it. I mean, this is what Indians all over will do. If there is an idol, God's idol, you look after it. Or the other most popular story was one morning we woke up and under this tree in the village, there was an image of Hanuman. Of course it was, you know, God has come to our village, why wouldn't we worship it? And there were community feasts being mobilized around it. And suddenly you realized, and I realized, because I traveled from Calcutta, which is in the south, right up to the north, which is Shiliguri, Bagdogra, which itself is a very interesting part of India on the border of Nepal and Bhutan and India, on that international border, right across the state, everywhere. Unemployed, unoccupied young men had found something to do. They were worshipping Hanuman. They were organizing communal feasts. And when I, the nosy anthropologist, pushed them to explain this newfound piety, I said, does this have anything to do with voting for Narendra Modi? And they said, of course. Yes, we love him, but we are just worshipping Hanuman. And so thereby hangs the tale.
I think we've given you, or you've given us, a marvelous introduction to Indian politics and Indian elections, and you'll see you've brought in all the different strands. No, not at all. You brought in all the strands which lie around and immerse what the election commissioner is trying to run. What's the main message of your book?
I think there are some messages, more than one. One is that the election commission, in spite of the figures that you mentioned, 900 million and so on, runs like a very well-oiled machine. It's got thousands of links in a chain. Each of those chains must be in place. And as the chief election commissioner, and assisted by 2 election commissioners and a not very large staff, it works perfectly. It is the largest and perhaps best management exercise in the world. I explained some of that. So while we have 900 million people, 600 million coming to vote, everybody can identify them. In 2009, when I did the election, the opposition came to me and said, we want a paper trail. So I said, we can't buy that off Marks and Sparks. It's going to take us 4 years or 5 years to be able to develop it, which we did. We began then. It continued beyond my tenure. And in this election, this recent election involving 600 million people, there was barely a complaint that there was a perfect match between the button a person pressed, the voter, and the result which was shown on a screen. So there have been questions about the EVM, but I've cast my views in stone. It cannot be tampered with. What I would like to briefly mention, and then take it on if there is time, is what are some of the things going wrong? Now, some of the things that are going very wrong, first let me just repeat some of the rights. We do our elections on time, every time. The result is accepted by the winner and the loser alike. I have been as observer to many countries where the results are not accepted, where the opposition will sit in the main square for months on end, where at 7 o'clock in the evening, people will get onto the balconies and bang every utensil in sight, and you can't hear yourself think. I've been to those countries as well. But in our country, we do it on time, every time, and the result is accepted. There may be murmurings of discontent, but the Election Commission has to be very, very careful in listening to those voices of discontent and making sure that there mustn't be any. But 3 or 4 things are going very wrong, John, as you know. You've lived in India, you've written about it. We are spending far too much money. It's all illicit money. We have criminal candidates coming in and we can't bar them. The Election Commission keeps applying to the government.
50% of the new MPs have got election.
Well, 16%, certainly, 16%, John, have heinous offences against them. And there are another 16% where, you know, the check could bounce. So it wouldn't be something that we'd worry about quite so much. But so we have criminals forming a part of parliament. We have people spending vast amounts of money. Have we become, or are we becoming, an oligarchy? Is this some very exclusive club in parliament that represents nobody but themselves? These are the things that are beginning to go very wrong. And the tragedy there, as it is still unfolding, is that for long years, 22 years, the Election Commission of India has sent so many recommendations to the government of the day, but none of the governments of the day. It doesn't have to be this one, it could be the last, the one before that. It could be independent legislators. You could be a member of parliament as an independent. And have you taken up the issue of the electoral reforms that the Election Commission has been posted to parliament year after year? The answer is no. That's the worry.
You tell a story in your book about how you met a party leader, I think at an airport, and you said to him, why do you have so many criminals in your standing for your party? And he said that it was, he couldn't do anything about it. But if you wanted to call him to a meeting when there was no election in sight, he'd sign on the dotted line for whatever you wanted to present him with to sign. But come the election, he wouldn't listen to you.
Well, he was frank.
Which party?
The leader of a very important party. I better not name him because, you know, there'll be some... you have to guard you against defamation suits. You, the organizer. And what about this young lady here? She doesn't want suits coming into the LSC. Sure, she'd love to. I'll tell you privately.
You were the election commissioner at the time.
I was the chief election commissioner, and I said, "Hello, uncle." Well, these were the safe places to talk to people at airports, you know. And so why do you have these criminals? This guy's got a string of cases against him. Look at that name. So he said, yes. But, you know, we only have one mantra at the time of elections, and that is winnability. No other mantra. But if elections aren't in sight and you call me in, I'll sign on the dotted line, which, of course, he had never any intention of doing, and nor do any of the others.
And it's a good dynasty, and it still runs in the state which it was in when...
It does. It's more than running the state. But I don't know if all of you have noticed, or the India hands have noticed, when we go to Parliament. Parliament is a very cozy club. Doesn't matter how you've got in, how much money you spent, what cases you might have against you. But not one parliamentarian in that club ever speaks against another. So once you've got into that railway compartment, you're all companions traveling together. And we from the Election Commission, we write, and the letter gets shredded. Or it goes into a parliamentary committee which goes on for 4 years, which is as good as shredding it anyway.
Navin, the election commission has always been one of the most, if not the most, respected independent institutions. And I want to come around to the independence in a moment. But the election commissioner, the chief election commissioner, has also been regarded as independent. I guess that this started with a very famous election commissioner called T.N. Sheshan, who thought he ran the country, I think, if not the world, when he was election commissioner, from 1990 to 1996. I asked you yesterday who was before then, because although I was in India, I can't remember. And you said, well, it was civil servants, retired civil servants, but it wasn't that important. But Sheshan set a new record, a new platform basis on which the election commissioner should be totally independent of government, of the ruling party or any other party. Is he the man who set all that? Am I right?
Yeah, and he's my inspiration. He doesn't keep very well, but every third or fourth day I speak to him in Chennai. I've sent him this book, which criticizes him a little, but he's been broad shoulders. But yes, till then we had very good civil servants. And but, you know, it was seen as a kind of, the Election Commission was really viewed as a kind of government department. Until Session looked at Article 324, and he famously started, if you ever knew Mr. Session, you were more likely to quarrel with him than anything else. He is quarrelsome. And so he quarreled with the Prime Minister, which was inevitable. And then at one particular quarrel, he said, if you think that I'm going to oblige you by dying, I'm not. If you think you can remove me, you can't, because the process of impeachment is such that you don't have the requisite numbers. So I'm here to stay. And he wanted very few things. He wanted the independence of the Election Commission. So that when an election was taking place, what he wanted was, he wanted all of you, let's say as observers, to be sent to different constituencies to observe the election and report on it, and you'd be reporting to the Election Commission. And he wanted some central forces, because no politician actually ends up trusting their own state forces. And when Narasimha Rao said no,
who was the Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister, then he said, all right, I'm not doing any more elections. So there was consternation in the country. He didn't do elections for 3. But you know, it's not easy to take on Prime Ministers in our country. Is it easy to take on Prime Ministers in Britain? No. Easy? Difficult? Easy. In India, very difficult. So he didn't do elections. The Prime Minister capitulated, gave him the observers, gave him the police force, but then handed him 2 more election commissioners to bind him onto the left and to the right. So we became a triumvirate, which is not a bad thing.
Each government tries to make sure that the chief election commissioner for the next election is going to be one of their people, is going to be favourable to them. And there's 3 election commissioners, and they move up in Buggin's turn, as we call it, to become the chief. And how did that affect you? You were appointed in 2005 when Congress was in power, and you became Chief Election Commissioner in 2009 when Congress was still in power. Without getting into that election yet, how did you regard yourself?
Well, I was seen as a Congress appointee, but everybody is seen as somebody's appointee. If you're a Supreme Court judge in the United States, you're appointed by a particular government, but you grow in, and you're appointed not just for a term, you're appointed for life, but you grow into the responsibility of the chair that you occupy. I had the advantage of being appointed in 2005, and I was therefore able to watch and participate in at least 50 state elections. So I wasn't actually thrown into the deep end. I picked up all the nuances and the difficulties of doing elections. So by the time I became Chief Election Commissioner, and the first phase of that, it's quite an interesting one, was my predecessor who did the first phase. Then he had to retire at the age of 65, and I did the remaining 5 phases. So the world couldn't seem to understand how you could have a change of horses in the middle of an election, but we did. And it wasn't difficult. But you grow into that position because you have to be appointed. The point that I just in a sentence like to make is that in India, we Indians have an opinion on everything, every time. I mean, 20 opinions a day. We are made like this. You can stop anybody in the street, and if you ask them directions, I mean, they all have an opinion here, here, here. They'll all mislead you, but we have an opinion. We are not like countries where we don't have opinions. Now, if you are a chief election commissioner and you are doing that election, you have to be right by India for every single step you take. Because if you take one misstep, our country neither forgets nor easily forgives. So one has to be very careful. One has to try and fill oneself. It doesn't matter who would appoint me, a Manmohan Singh or a Modi, but I've got to be able to do an election with complete integrity in sync with the country's mood.
But along with that integrity, you would agree that you were a pro-Congress, you were a Congress sympathizer, follower, your loyalty was to the Congress.
No. If I had loyalty to the Congress party, then I 45 years ago or 50 years ago would have joined the Congress party and dare say been a minister 6 times over. That wasn't the route that I ever wanted to take. I've been perceived as being very close to the Congress, but as I said, when you get appointed, and I'd been 4 years an election commissioner before becoming the chief, there is only one mantra. The mantra is integrity. And every single decision that I ever took was a collegiate decision. Not just the 3 of us as commissioners, but if these were the 20 officers in the room, they were all part of decision making. So I think that it was not a question of muddled through quite well. We did an election with integrity. We did it impeccably so that whether it was President Obama or David Cameron or Abe or whoever they were, the congratulations just poured in. And this could not have happened. Even Mamta agreed that it was a fair election.
You should go and become a politician.
Me?
You.
Not yet. British universities have to decline a bit more for me to give up on them. If I may just add to what Mr. Chawla has said, that it's interesting that Why India Votes, the book in front of you, is based on research conducted during the 2009 national elections when Mr. Chawla was Chief Election Commissioner. So we're talking about the same election, in a sense, in our idea of elections. And there are 2 or 3 things that need to be kept in mind when we're talking about elections, which is that when you say every vote counts, which is the title of your book, and mine, which is Why India Votes, that's exactly why India votes, because every Indian citizen considers the importance of their singular vote. There is no concept of free riding. Why should I vote? Everybody else can go and vote. Why should I give up my holiday? That sense, by and large, doesn't exist in India. People vote, and our voting turnouts go up practically at every election. This time we had record turnouts again. But also, people like voting. There is something about the act of going to the polling station, and I've written about this extensively, and if you have time, we can talk about it later. But I think the way to judge whether a chief election commissioner is political or not is not so much by the appointment as by the record of decisions taken during the elections. And I think this really came home to roost in 2019, where for the first time in a long time, for all of us watching elections, there was a real sense that the impartiality of the Election Commission, that everybody who is interested in Indian politics held so dear. This was the first time there was open dissent amongst the election commissioners. And of course, in a committee of 3, there's going to be dissent, but the point was to come to a sense of consensus between them. This time, things got so bad that one of the election commissioners actually came out in public that his dissenting note was not being recorded, and he felt that everybody needed to know this because he felt the chief election commissioner and the other election commissioner were ruling in favor of one political party, which happened to be the dominant political party.
Could I just interrupt for a second? That election commissioner had senior jobs in the government. He'd been made by the Modi government the finance secretary and the environment secretary. So the government must have thought that he was a
Pliant civil servant.
Yes, because he'd done these senior jobs, and then he was post.
Sure, and in that sense, if it's the government chooses the person to be election commissioners, you feel you're putting your own
Even he
people.
couldn't take it, I meant.
Yes. And therefore, I think in your defense or anyone else, when we're talking about impartiality, we have to talk about the record of the Election Commission and how it rules. Now, this election in 2019 saw unprecedented levels of hate speech, unprecedented levels of flouting of the model code of conduct in ways that, frankly, surprised a lot of people that this was permissible. And the Election Commission repeatedly did not come down heavily
and
on
that
them.
was being done by Modi, by Prime Minister Modi, and by Amit Shah in particular, and by the Chief Minister of UP.
Indeed, and very, very senior figures of the Bharatiya Janata Party, and they were not cautioned, they were not disciplined, and in fact, the complaints were thrown out. This, therefore, for the first time in 2019, there was a real concern about the record and the performance of the Election Commission of India, which until this point we had all celebrated.
And then, to cap it all, on the last night before polling, before the last day of polling, when and in India, polling and alcohol as well are all banned for the last 48 hours before the vote, the Election Commission gave the Prime Minister, and many of you may have seen it in the newspapers or on television, permission to go on a holy trek to the Himalayas where he was photographed. There was a continual photo opportunity media blitz right through one evening as he solemnly trekked through the snow and then went to a cave and clothed himself in orange coloured shawl, just him in this cave, appealing to Hindu voters, to his vote bank, to really vote. And that was the most blatant example of the Election Commission allowing something to happen, which absolutely shouldn't. I mean, it knocked into, it obliterated everything else. What do you think, Navin, about what we've just seen? I know you don't want, because you said you don't want to personally talk about the Election Commissioner because you don't feel that's right, having been one yourself. But give us a comment on what you've seen in those weeks.
And what did Mr. Sessions say on the phone when you spoke with him? The big three.
I knew this googly was coming. When you ask me what I think will go into my memoirs or the next book.
But it'll help you get a good
but,
advantage if you start telling us now.
But a former Chief Justice of India doesn't comment on the present. A former Chief Election Commissioner can't and shouldn't comment. And I don't want... Proper. Let me develop this theme a little. I can give you an example. I never commented on the 2004 general election. I didn't comment on the 2014. I don't want to begin on the 2019, but I will. Can I give you an example or two from my own time on how I would have tackled it or did tackle it in my time? I got a message that the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh wanted to hold a series of meetings in his official house. And I knew those meetings would be political because this is election time. So I said, no, you can't. You can go to a hotel, you can go to your party headquarters, but you cannot hold it in your official residence. A cabinet meeting is different. But a meeting that spills over onto electoral matters is a no-no. And I have to say that he complied, and all the meetings were held somewhere else, but not in the official residence. I did have chief ministers. Who are the people who flout the rules? The people who flout the rules are the people who are in power at that time. So if you're the chief minister at that time, you're more likely to flout the rules than him, and if he's only the leader of the opposition. You have the controls of government in your hands, so that's what you want to take advantage of. So we had 4 chief ministers, as it happened, because it was a Congress government, of Congress-ruled states, and they were beginning to behave very badly. And I said, you just can't. I'm doing a session on you. And if you persist, then I am writing to the president and recommending president's rule. So that scared everybody, and everybody fell in line. And after, I didn't have many problems. 2009 was also not the time of fake news. It was the beginning of paid news. So while we had money power, which vitiates what's a level playing field if you're going to spend 70 lakhs, which is your statutory limit, and you're going to spend 30 crores, which is well beyond the statutory limit. Everything is warped. We made such a big fuss in our country, and rightly too, on that horrible Nirbhay case. And yet in the self-declared affidavits, there are MPs who declare rape. And we elect them. Isn't that a shame? So we've been pressing again and again for electoral reform. Please see to it that those who have criminal antecedents should not be given tickets. Please see that you remain within your statutory spending limit. So my answer to all this, is there an answer? So my answer is that we must go back to some form of public funding as we have in Britain, as we have in Scandinavia, as we have in Germany, as we even have in Bhutan, where I helped them with setting up their elections. So we have many things going wrong, but just to once again touch back on what John said, the establishment in 2009 behaved itself. And it behaved itself because the Chief Election Commissioner, who is indisputably the most powerful person during elections, more than the Prime Minister, can crack the whip. But if a Chief Election Commissioner chooses not to crack a whip and to go along with what's going on, then therein lies the tragedy.
It's interesting, it's amazing that despite all these problems, and I've got a whole list of problems we haven't gone into here about the bribing and the muscle power and the black money and money being delivered in envelopes, in a 500 rupee note in an envelope delivered with your morning newspaper. 500 rupees at the time was £7. And WikiLeaks apparently said it was 5,000 rupees, which would have been £70.
And now 10,000.
and now 10,000. And despite all that, and people see through it. I mean, I've got a direct example in Sultanpur village on the edge of Delhi in 2014, where I was told by somebody who did it, the vans turned up from both BJP and Congress, and both handed out money, so he took the vote money from both, and then he went home to his family, and they enjoyed the money and decided who they were going to vote for. So it doesn't always count. It doesn't always have an effect. Or how much does it have an effect? Mukulika.
No, it's interesting academic research on vote buying.
Sorry, and we're talking about alcohol and saris and laptop computers and a whole range of things. Sorry.
Academic research on vote buying across the world shows that it's the least reliable way to win an election. Right? It just doesn't work. You always hear about vote buying. You never hear any accounts of vote selling, which is exactly what you've described. Now, poor Indian voters, among whom my research is conducted, see elections as a redistributive moment. So you ask them, did you get a sari? Yes, of course I got a sari. Did you get a liter of kerosene? Yes, I did. And you say, so does this mean you're going to vote for them? And they said, sorry, what does that have to do with my vote? And I said, but why did you take it then? And they said, well, you wouldn't understand. If you had one sari and the other sari was stone and that's all you had and somebody's handing out free saris, you sure take it. But you think my vote is the price of a sari? It can be bought so cheaply. Now, what the vote therefore means is much, much more valuable, right? And this is common illiterate voters across the country have this sense. What is a bigger problem, if I may, John, because we're coming up to the end of it. And I think this, this is a systemic problem, and it's something that as citizens and concerned citizens, we need to raise much more, is the secrecy of the ballot. The reason why a lot of Indians vote with such enthusiasm in such large numbers is also because they feel their ballot is secret. The secret ballot is really important. They can withstand. Nobody can say, well, you took my sari, but you didn't vote for me, because you think, well, who cares? Who knows who I voted for? In effect, though, ballots in India are no longer secret. And the reason for this is because every polling station, which covers 800 to 1,000 voters, has one polling EVM, an electronic voting machine. When counting is done, you count machine by machine by machine. Now, what is gold dust for scholars of Indian politics, academics who do research, and journalists, is that we look at polling booth data, therefore. So where I conduct research, for instance, these two adjacent villages, they have one polling booth. Sitting in my office at LSE, I can look at the Election Commission of India website, look at the polling booth number, and I can tell you how many people voted BJP, how many voted Trinamool, how many voted Left Front. In a population of 850 voters, that is pretty revealing. You know who's voted for whom. And this was, and we've been saying this for a while, there is a technical solution to this that the Election Commission of India commissioned and has brought about, called the totalizing machine, which will electronically mix the ballots before they are counted. This is what used to happen with paper ballots. This is what happens in British elections here. Wherever there are paper ballots, you mix them before you count them. So you can't trace neighborhoods, polling stations, to vote distribution. But this has been actively resisted by the BJP, but not just the BJP. Other political parties with cadres have resisted it, because this is gold mine data for them too. Because you know which neighborhoods haven't voted for you. And one of the candidates of the ruling party, in fact, said it quite obviously in her campaign speech this time, Maneka Gandhi. She said, if we find that in this area you did not vote for us, there will be repercussions. This is not how democracy is meant to work. Elections are meant to create governments and an opposition. This is not about victors and the vanquished. It's not about a government being for the people who voted for them. You're meant to be a government for everybody in the country. And that basic aspect of Indian democracy, Indian elections, stands compromised.
Which makes you wonder how secret the current ballot of MPs for or against Boris is going. And how much the voting of the members later will be. Before we go on to questions, which we need to do in the next 2 or 3 minutes, despite all this, despite all these problems, it works. I mean, visitors come and criticize Indian democracy for all the reasons that we've just, the system, for all the reasons that we've just discussed, but it works. And it is accepted, as you started off by saying. And yet occasionally, crowds and mass demonstrations, and I'm raising this because of what's happened in Hong Kong in the last week or so. Occasionally in this democracy, the crowds, the mass protests have an impact. And most noticeably on the demonstrations against corruption, I think it was 2012, and then a year later against rape. What's your view on this? I mean, both of you, the role of mass protest, because one has to celebrate the fact, I think, that in Hong Kong, mass demonstrations have amazingly made Beijing change its mind about whether to go ahead with the extradition law, which made people fear that anybody going to Hong Kong could be picked up and taken across into China under that extradition law. And it wasn't a decision of the Hong Kong government that made that change. There was a meeting of top Beijing officials in Shenzhen that 2 or 3 days before. They made the decision. They told Carrie Lam. I used to live in Hong Kong, so I follow this closely. And there we saw Beijing having to bend, and it'll be fascinating to watch how this spins out. But in India, we have also seen, as I just said, mass protests suddenly take off, and the governments in both cases didn't know how to handle it to begin with. What's your view?
Well, it supported a political party called the Aam Aadmi Party, and I wrote about it because I was so happy that they conducted elections in Delhi. They had the street corner collections, 1 rupee, 2 rupees, 100 rupees. There was no criminality. People didn't know them. And they swept to power. Out of 70 seats, they earned 67. And I wrote twice because it was the most exhilarating moment for me that a political party had been able to break away from money and criminality. But we've gone back to form. And this election, I'm carrying a book from a little pamphlet from a friend whom I wanted to meet just before coming here. This is a friend called Bhaskar Rao, and he invariably, he doesn't have very large sample sizes, but he invariably tries to put a finger to how much an election costs. This election has, and I've been saying this in my speeches and on television, so I'm not saying anything new to you. I've said it all over India. This has been the most expensive election ever. We've spent 60,000 crores. Now, how does it add up? We are 542 members of parliament. We're not allowed to spend 70 lakhs each. There could be 5 contestants from 5 different parties. That would still add up to 10,000 rupees. Where are we spending 60,000? So what's equal? If I'm spending 70 lakhs and you're spending 50 crores, this is not an equal competition. What's the way out? So for years we've been writing, please let's have some form of state-funded election. Because if we do not go back to that, we are already an oligarchy. We are ending up in a plutocracy. The next election will be even more expensive. So is there a way out? And this is what I would like to leave this audience to think about. We've spelled out the broader issues, the things that are going right, the things that are going wrong. But what's the solution to the things going wrong? Or are they invariably to go wrong? The question that John raised was about a member of parliament for the upper house who starts a very fancy airline. And he comes and spends a lot of money and comes into the upper house. And then when I asked the people in the upper house, how can he be placed? He, the airline owner, can be placed on a select committee for civil aviation. Is this surely not a conflict of interest? Surely it is. And everybody agreed it was conflict of interest except the 22 MPs who signed and who said, no, it's not conflict of interest. It's domain expertise. Now, I mean, that is a tragedy. So we've got to start looking at reform.
And the domain where this gentleman will one day maybe become an expert is Tihar jail. At the moment he's in London, and India's trying to get him back. Vijay Mallya, founder of Kingfisher Airline, who, as you say, became a Rajya Sabha MP, and was renowned for having paid a large amount of money to one or two parties in order to get that post. And as soon as he got the post, he was put on the aviation committee. And I went to interview him when I was writing for The Economist to do a profile, and he kept me waiting for an hour because he was sitting in a meeting of the aviation committee.
But HarperCollins, my cautious publishers, didn't allow me to give his name, but the name is revealed by John. So if there are any representatives, please head your litigation in that direction, not me.
And I didn't ask you to confirm it.
You know, these journalists who were with The Economist at one time, they're just so clever.
Mukulika, a comment on, we've moved on slightly, but let's go back to Hong Kong.
Just
briefly.
to Hong Kong, it is always heartening when you see people on the streets able to influence decision making. Right? And for those of us who have been on demonstrations a number of times where, you know, the famous anti-Iraq war in London, where millions of people showed up and it made not the slightest bit of difference to the government's decision, still haunts that generation and everybody who was on it. So when you see it in Hong Kong, you think there is people power. It is when you're not heard through the ballot box, you need to take to the streets. What is interesting in the Indian context is that we've had millions, thousands at least, of farmers marching on the streets of the capital of India about a crisis in agriculture, in rural India, which is so remote and so beyond the ken of understanding of urban India that it made not the slightest bit of difference. So I think we also have to think about who's marching, where they're marching. Is there someone listening as well? Just marching is not enough.
And there was legislation on rape, of course, but it hasn't.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the security of women in Delhi remains just as it was.
Before. Okay, questions. There's one just right by where you're sitting, standing now. Yeah. And
Mr. Chawla, you mentioned about Indians having an opinion on almost everything that there is. Is there any advice you could give us in the UK as to how to get out of the mess that we're in?
You know, I would have tried, but for the last 3 years of trying to grapple with this Brexit in, Brexit out, I just haven't got a clue. But is it the beginning of the end of the Conservative Party? I mean, we see this picture of the big Winston Churchill and the somewhat smaller Margaret Thatcher, and then we have somebody with his curly hair down to the level of a pygmy. I don't know enough, but I'm very confused.
That was a marvelously short, brief question. Let's have the other ones equally brief.
Hi, Mr. Chawla. This is you mentioned in sync with the country's mood. Does that translate as Hindutva?
In sync with
You said in sync with the country's mood. That's how elections are held. You mentioned it's in sync with the country's mood.
Mood.
Mood. M-O-O-D. Mood.
Yeah.
Did I say that?
Yeah, you just mentioned it. Yes, you did.
I don't usually get onto this Hindutva debate.
No, I'm asking you. Does that translate as Hindutva? You needn't say anything.
No, I think that these things will come and these things will be overtaken by other broad phenomenon. But my central thesis, which I want to continue to write and hammer home, is that we must have electoral reforms, otherwise we are lost. We cannot have another election which then costs twice as much money when our statutory limits are there. So are we a democracy? If you have entered parliament, and I just leave this brief thought with any of us, Ranjit there has entered parliament with 70 lakhs and I've entered, and an MP has told me this to my face, with 52 crores, then he would be spending his 5 years recouping that money and more. And who is that person representing? And we made a mistake because we've taken the model of Westminster. Here you have 500 and odd members of parliament, a much smaller house, a much smaller country. You're members of parliament. You can go to your constituency, tour around, and come back and go to sleep. You're home for bed. In our constituencies, you're trekking 14 days before you even reach a lonely village on the outpost. So did we choose the right model? Do we have enough people? These are other things to think about. The Westminster model, I don't think has suited us.
We've got 6 minutes. So let's take 3 questions. One there.
I haven't read your book, but my question is slightly broader. You talk about the perilous state of democracy in India and the faults in it and your attempts to reform it. Well, what about the bigger danger facing democracy in general? Because no matter which party comes into power, eventually it is the corporate world which is so
No, a
huge in
question,
its
please,
impact.
because we haven't got time.
Yeah,
A question.
Yeah, the question is, what about the bigger threat to democracy, where the corporate world controls?
What is the question?
The question is, do you have any views about it, rather than just
No, your
tinkering
question-
with the reforms?
Let's take 3.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can we have 2 more? One up there, and then one here.
You
Yeah.
give us quite a depressing view of the chances of electoral reform. But Radio 4 has a program called The Long View, which compares certain events against previous histories. So if you take the long view, are you optimistic or depressed about the chance of electoral reform?
Thank you. That's good. Thank you. And one here. Yeah.
Optimistic.
No, but let's one more question. No, you. Yeah.
Can I just ask about the duration of the electoral process, the election process? One distorting factor in India is that an election can take 6 to 8 weeks. Doesn't that add a distorting factor in campaigning, electoral process, and in the process of arriving at a fair conclusion in the elections?
Right. Would you like to take that first, Mukulika? And then could we come round here to over there?
I think the question of the phases of elections has been, it's been examined and justified multiple times by previous chief election commissioners. You can see why it's required. It requires security. There is a finite number of troops. They have to be moved around. They're polling officials, EVMs, etc. There are logistics that justify. What was interesting this time, for instance, was how many states had how many phases. And a lot of people raised questions about why small states like Odisha and West Bengal had 6 phases, which was seen to be unnecessary. So when the phased election is used for political purposes, it raises questions. Previously, phases themselves have not been a problem.
And are you optimistic?
No.
Thank you. Navin.
I've forgotten all the questions. This is what happens when moderators say
There was the general optimism, and there was a question about
Electoral
the future.
reform and-
The long view. The optimism for the long view.
Yes, I think that if I were to take that Chinese long view, I'd be optimistic. I would be optimistic.
Why?
Because I think
Briefly?
that, did you hear me?
Yes.
I think that people like us, and we're roping in about half of you, are going to continue to hammer for the need for electoral reform. And once some of those reforms come, albeit through the Supreme Court, because that's our savior, I think things will improve. So I think it's a very important question that you asked me. I'm going to remember it, and I'm going to work towards the long view.
You've now got a nice traditional blue microphone too, which looks very smart.
Then there was another question somewhere. Ranjit,
Yes.
phased elections.
Yes.
But we can't help it because the funny thing is that you are a state chief minister, and during your tenure, you sort of recruit thousands of policemen. But when a general election comes along, you don't trust the people you've recruited. So you want people from central forces. And so when we get those forces, then it has to be divided. The plight of the policeman, he has to go to one constituency be there for 4 or 5 days, get acclimatized, get into a train and go to the next, and the next, and the next. So that's what phases the elections too, because people don't trust the police other than the central police.
And one question there, William?
Thank you. The issue of mass demonstrations, which you mentioned, I mean, they may or may not have an influence. My impression has been that mass demonstrations have taken place between elections. I'm thinking back to the Mandalization reservation issues, which had absolutely no impact on the subsequent regulation. You mentioned the farmers' crisis. Were there any issues in this election which really had an impact?
While the microphone's going to the back, why don't you answer that? One of you.
Were there any issues? This was a fairly issue-free election. I mean, there were issues. Unemployment and the agrarian crisis are serious issues in India, but there was very little of the campaign that focused on issues or on policy.
And the main issue was that if you disagreed with the government, then you were Pakistan.
Okay, thank you.
But just to add to something, I have witnessed elections in Mexico. The result has not been accepted by the loser. Obrador is therefore in the public square for 7 months as a consequence to that immediate election. We haven't had that sort of thing.
Quick ones there.
Thank you, Parvez Alam. Chief Election Commissioner in India enjoys immense powers. It's not easy to sack him. But the other two election commissioners can be sacked. They do not enjoy the same power. So when one of the member expresses his or her dissent, there's a problem for this person. Don't you think that these two election commissioners should also enjoy the same power? Finally, just quick one. In your opinion, what would be the 2 reforms that you would like to see that Election Commission adopts as soon as possible?
And there's one more question there.
May I answer that first, John? May I answer that? Because this is the most important question that has arisen today. Nobody suffered this situation more than I did. I was election commissioner for 4 years, and I had a view on everything. And I used to give my dissenting notes. Now, if you were my boss, the chief election commissioner, you didn't appreciate any of them. But then we had equal powers. So when that happened, he did try to remove me. And as soon as I became secure as chief election commissioner, I wrote to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh that I'm writing to you because now I'm constitutionally secure. The other 2 must get the same security and they must be promoted in terms of their seniority. Do you think I got a reply from Dr. Manmohan Singh? I think my letter went into the shredder as well. But it's in my book, it's in the last chapter, and we must continue to fight for that.
That's it, I'm afraid. Sorry to the people who haven't asked questions, and thank you all for coming.
But
and
John,
thank you.
Hasn't Sanjoy given us another 15
Thank you,
minutes?
everybody, for attending this session, The Dance of Democracy, that was supported by the Aga Khan Foundation. And if you could join me in thanking our speakers once again, Navin Chawla, Mukulika Banerjee, and John Elliott.